A hard, sudden sound split the afternoon, and the highway gave way like paper. Metal screamed, concrete exploded, and a strip of the city folded into a river of dust and glass. A man in red and blue hung in that torn sky, eyes cold, and people were shredding themselves away from him. Cars crumpled under falling girders. A bus rolled and snapped like a toy, and somewhere a child's cry threaded through the smoke while sirens started like a second heartbeat. I was standing with my hands in my pockets on the sidewalk 3 blocks away, watching the arc of destruction and calculating whether stepping forward would make the traffic worse. It would not be worth the trouble. He landed hard enough to dent the plaza and kept looking, not at the city, but at the pattern people made when they learned to expect violence as an answer. And reporters already framed him as salvation, while soldiers checked their orders. This is only the beginning. A single refusal to perform the violence they expect will not leave the world unchanged, and worse consequences are already unspooling beyond the first blast. You need to know what happens next, and this isn't a request so much as a warning. If you listen all the way through, you'll see how every institution bends when a weapon stops playing along. So subscribe now and don't say later you weren't told. The fallout only accelerates from here. By the time the second overpass gave out, the pattern was already obvious enough to be inconvenient. The first collapse had been loud and messy, which meant traffic would be rerouted into the surrounding grid, and the walk home would take longer than usual. But the second one showed that whoever was flying overhead didn't care where the force landed as long as it landed somewhere public. A streak of heat carved a diagonal line across the glass face of an office tower, and the top 5 floors sagged in a way that suggested the next 10 would follow. People were running toward open intersections, which meant those would fill up fastest. I adjusted my grocery bag so the leak wouldn't bruise and stepped out of the bike lane just as a car pinwheeled through it, its shadow moving faster than its sound. He came down hard enough to make the plaza breathe out dust in a wide, low ring that reached the curb where I was standing. The cape settled a moment after he did, which told me he liked the way it looked in the air and didn't mind the delay. When he turned, the eyes were already lit, not searching for danger but for attention. And the way the cameras swung toward him confirmed that this part of the city was used to treating a landing like a promise. I watched the heat build at the corners of his gaze and made the small decision not to dodge, unless it meant replacing dinner. The first beam crossed the street at chest height and took the hood off a taxi behind me, which caused the driver to break into the median and block 2 lanes in the direction I needed. I stayed where I was, because moving would mean stepping into the stream of people trying to get away from him, and that would slow things down more than it would help. The second beam tracked lower and touched the pavement in front of my shoes, liquefying a neat line of asphalt that cooled into a warped ridge while he watched for a reaction that wasn't coming. He hovered closer in a way that suggested he wanted to feel the air move around something that didn't move back. Up close, his landing had cracked the stone in a clean circle, and the smell of burned dust meant he'd used the eyes at full intensity somewhere before this block. A camera drone dipped between us and corrected itself as his head tilted, as if the silence where a flinch should have been had weight. The next pass of heat didn't aim to miss. It reached my shoulder, pressed there, and slid off like a hand finding nothing to grip. The bag shifted when the leak rolled, which was enough of a nuisance to make me adjust my stance so it wouldn't happen again. Behind him, a storefront gave up its window in a sheet that folded outward into the street, and the resulting scatter of glass meant anyone trying to cross would have to go around or risk slipping. He closed the distance the rest of the way, boots cutting shallow trenches through the dust as he landed again without taking his eyes off me. The plaza had gone quieter than the surrounding blocks, which was useful because it meant fewer people would run into the newly fallen awning that now blocked the sidewalk to my left. He struck once, fast, and without the kind of wind-up that would warn a bystander, and the impact pushed the air back toward the street without changing anything else that mattered. The effect was predictable. The decorative fountain behind me split along a hairline that had been waiting for a reason, and water began to spill into the shallow bowl in a way that would eventually flood the curb. That would be another detour later, when the drains failed and the buses tried to reroute through a block that couldn't handle it. A woman with a press badge, Starlight, stopped at the edge of the dust and didn't step closer, which told me she understood the cameras needed a witness, even if the situation didn't need a hero. Her eyes moved from the cracks at his feet to my shoulder, where the fabric had blackened without tearing, and the set of her jaw changed in a way that suggested the story she'd been prepared to tell no longer fit. He went back to the eyes because it had worked on everything else so far. The light was brighter this time, and the line held steady at face level, which meant the bus shelter behind me would melt before the scheduled display did. I shifted half a step to keep the grocery bag out of the worst of the heat, because replacing it would mean waiting in another line tonight. Across the street, a man in a suit, Ashley Barrett, was already on a phone that would not stop ringing, and the first chopper cut a tight circle above us to keep the angle on his profile. The city had decided this was a confrontation whether it was or not, and the institutions that ran on spectacle had begun to move. He paused then, not because anything had changed in me, but because nothing had. The realization was small, and it arrived without drama. The pattern he expected wasn't present, and the lack of it made the rest of his options feel like tests rather than answers. Behind us, a support column that had taken the earlier beam finally gave up, and the overhang above the pharmacy dropped a foot in a single, heavy motion that would turn into a full collapse once the vibrations reached the far joint. That was going to block the ambulance route on 7th, which meant the next emergency would arrive late. The conflict had already started something that wouldn't stop when either of us left. The pharmacy overhang didn't collapse all at once, which was worse for the people trying to decide whether to run under it or around it. The first drop had been enough to tilt the metal frame, and now every vibration from the plaza, every footstep, every siren, every camera drone correcting its position, translated into a slow, creeping shift that turned hesitation into a hazard. I could already see the way the sidewalk would buckle when the final joint gave out, and the best route home would move 2 blocks west unless something else fell first. He didn't move away when the crowd thinned. He moved closer because the lack of resistance was beginning to read like refusal instead of fear. When he struck again, it wasn't to break anything specific, but to check whether there was a threshold he could cross that would force a reaction out of me. And the impact lifted dust into a flat wave that rolled toward the curb and made a cyclist lose control 10 meters behind us. I watched the bike skid into a parked car and made a note to step around the growing knot of traffic that would follow. Starlight had taken another step forward before she stopped herself, which meant she understood that intervening would only give the cameras a third story to tell and make the next few minutes harder to predict. Her attention kept moving between his hands and my posture, because neither of them were behaving the way her experience suggested they should. The drone above us dipped again and held its position, framing the distance between us as if it were a decision someone had made on purpose. He returned to the eyes with a steadiness that suggested he'd decided to treat this as a procedure. The beam tracked across my chest and shoulder and into the bus shelter behind me, where the plexiglass softened and bowed until it spilled into the street in a clear, sagging sheet that would trip anyone trying to cross in a hurry. I shifted my grocery bag to my other hand to keep the heat from cooking the eggs, because cleaning that up later would take longer than replacing the shelter. When he grabbed my collar, the fabric stretched just enough to tell me the seam would hold if I didn't move too much. He lifted, paused, and then drove me down into the stone he'd already cracked, not to break it further, but to see whether the change in angle would matter. It didn't. Although the fountain behind us finished splitting along the line he'd started earlier and began to pour into the shallow bowl in a way that would flood the curb within minutes. Across the street, Ashley Barrett had stopped trying to keep her voice down on the phone. The chopper widened its circle as the plaza filled with the kind of attention that makes institutions feel like they're already late. And somewhere in that chain of calls, a decision would be made to treat what was happening as a failure of compliance rather than a misunderstanding of effort. He stepped back and watched, not for damage but for acknowledgement. And when neither arrived, he took to the air again so he could come down harder from a better angle. The landing fractured the outer ring of the plaza and sent a shallow crack toward the pharmacy, which answered by dropping another inch and sealing the sidewalk with a dull, final sound that would redirect every emergency vehicle onto 7th. Starlight's mouth opened as if she were about to say something to him, but she stopped when the heat returned and cut a bright, precise line through the traffic light at the corner. The signal sagged, twisted, and then fell into the intersection, turning a controlled stop into a four-way confusion that would ripple outward through the next dozen blocks. He wasn't trying to end this anymore. He was trying to define it. Each strike, each beam, each landing was calibrated to force the kind of answer that would let him file the moment away as a victory. And each time the answer failed to appear, the rest of the city paid the difference in broken routes and delayed responses. A man with a headset, A-Train, had arrived at the far end of the block and didn't move in, which told me the company had already decided that proximity was less valuable than footage. His eyes flicked from the fallen signal to the softening shelter, and back to the place where my shoulder had darkened without tearing, and the calculation on his face matched the one Ashley was now saying out loud to someone who could authorize a larger mistake. The overhang finally gave up in a full drop that sent a flat, heavy slab into the street and blocked the ambulance lane completely. Somewhere, a siren changed pitch as a driver realized the route was gone, and the first detour began to form as cars tried to turn around in a space that couldn't take them. He hovered again, closer this time than before, and the pause between us had changed from a performance into a problem that would not resolve itself on camera. The test had become the point, and the city had begun to bend around it. By the time the third siren changed pitch and rerouted toward 7th, the response had already stopped being local. The first thing to move wasn't another hero or a police perimeter, but a classification, quietly updated inside Vought's internal network where incidents were sorted by how quickly they could be shaped into reassurance. Ashley Barrett was no longer trying to control the narrative for the cameras outside. She was trying to decide which version of this would cost less if it went wrong in front of shareholders. On the screen in front of her, Homelander hovered in the dust he'd made, facing someone who hadn't given him a reason to stop. The lack of movement where there should have been panic had turned the encounter into a compliance issue, and compliance failures were handled differently than threats because they suggested an audience might learn the wrong lesson if nothing corrected the frame. Starlight hadn't moved since the shelter fell. She understood that stepping in now would turn the moment into a team dynamic the public could parse, and parsing meant deciding who was right before the company had chosen its angle. Her eyes stayed on the place where the beam had tracked across my shoulder and done nothing useful except close a lane behind us, because that was the part that didn't fit. He landed again, this time with enough force to turn the plaza's outer cracks into a shallow ring that would propagate toward the pharmacy's back wall. That would bring the adjacent apartments into play if the foundation followed, which meant a second set of emergency routes would disappear when the elevators stopped working and the stairwells filled. I shifted the grocery bag to keep the eggs from knocking together as the vibration reached the curb. Avoiding the beam would have been simple, but stepping into the intersection now would tangle me with the drivers who were already trying to reverse out of a space that couldn't take them. Staying put kept the problem smaller. Inside Vought Tower, the live feed began to split into alternate angles as analysts tried to identify what had changed between the first collapse and now. The answer was not in the damage, which had been escalating in a familiar way, but in the absence of a counter-performance that would let Homelander end this on a line he could deliver later. Without a visible opponent, the company could not sell a resolution, Without a resolution, the moment could not be contained. Ashley's call reached someone who had the authority to move this from public relations into risk mitigation. The word non-compliant appeared where hostile usually would, and with it came a set of protocols designed for assets that refused direction rather than enemies who offered resistance. A-Train was told to hold position, which he did without argument because proximity would only increase the chance that the wrong clip reached the wrong audience. The chopper tightened its circle again, keeping Homelander centered as he raised his eyes for another pass that would, at minimum, remove the remaining traffic light from the corner. The beam cut through the pole and into the street beyond, where it traced a shallow groove that would catch rain later and turn into a hazard for anyone on foot. I stepped half a pace to keep the bag clear of the heat, because replacing groceries at this hour would mean waiting behind the detours that were already forming. Starlight saw it then, not as strength but as a decision. Avoiding the attacks would require effort, and the effort would push more people into the narrowed routes Homelander had already created. Remaining where I was kept the crowd's movement predictable, even if it encouraged him to try again. Ashley's analysts began to flag the pattern as a control failure rather than an engagement, and with that came a recommendation that would move the situation out of Homelander's hands without saying so directly. The city was no longer the audience, it was the variable. When he struck next, it was harder, and the crack that followed reached the pharmacy's back wall exactly where the stress had been building. The building answered with a slow, inward sag that would close the service alley and cut off the next ambulance before it arrived. Somewhere above us, a decision was made to deploy something that would not care about cameras. The first barrier went up 3 blocks east, not to keep anyone out but to slow everything down enough that the company could decide what to do without the street deciding for them. Concrete trucks angled across an avenue that had already lost its signal, and the resulting confusion pushed drivers into side streets that weren't designed to carry anything heavier than a delivery van. The detours fed into one another until the pattern of movement became a knot, and the knot began to tighten. He rose above it and looked down, not at the routes, but at the way people were forced to choose between waiting and risk. The absence of a response from me had turned the encounter into a problem of control, and control, when it fails in public, tends to widen until it includes everything nearby. I stepped off the curb because the water from the split fountain had reached my shoes, and staying there would mean wet socks for the rest of the evening. The intersection was worse than it had been a minute ago. The fallen light had turned a measured stop into a negotiation, and negotiations took longer than anyone wanted while sirens approached from streets that no longer connected. Starlight moved then, not toward him but toward the pharmacy's rear where the service alley had sagged. She understood that the next drop would seal it completely, and sealing it would strand the paramedics who were already trying to reverse through a lane narrowed by glass. Her hands were up, not in a show for the cameras, but to guide 2 people away from a doorway that would not open if the frame shifted another inch. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley's analysts began to model the spread of delay instead of the spread of damage. They understood that a city loses its shape when its routes fail, and a shapeless city cannot be managed on a schedule designed for applause. The recommendation that came back was simple: increase the pressure until a reaction could be filmed, or move the situation somewhere that would not multiply into infrastructure. He chose pressure because it was immediate. The landing this time carried enough force to finish what the earlier cracks had started, and the pharmacy's back wall gave way into the alley with a slow collapse that turned the ambulance route into a dead end. The siren that had been closest changed pitch again and fell silent as the driver realized the turn was gone. I shifted my path 2 steps north to avoid the crowd forming at the new blockage. Avoiding him would have meant stepping into the street, where the drivers were now trying to mount the curb to get around the fallen pole, and that would slow everyone else down more than it would help me. A-Train was told to begin perimeter sweeps, not to engage but to map how far the delay had spread. He flashed past the intersection and back again, eyes tracking the way a single dropped overhang had turned 3 blocks into a loop. The loop would feed back into itself until someone cut it. Homelander's eyes lit once more, and the beam took the last intact street sign at the corner, erasing the only clear marker the detoured traffic had left. The resulting hesitation turned a near miss into a collision that blocked the lane I had intended to use. Starlight saw the pattern settle into something that would not correct itself. Each attempt to force a response had instead removed another option for everyone else, and the city had begun to function around the absence rather than the threat. Above us, the chopper's angle shifted as a second aircraft approached without markings. The battleground had stopped being the plaza and started being everything that depended on it. The second aircraft didn't circle for a better shot. It held position just beyond the chopper's orbit, as if the street below were no longer a scene, but a variable to be contained. Its lack of markings made it easier for Vought to describe later, and harder for anyone on the ground to guess which chain of command had decided this was no longer a company problem. The downdraft pushed dust back into the intersection and flattened the tape someone had tried to string between 2 bent poles. Armored vehicles arrived without sirens because the route they needed had already been closed by the fallen overhang. They came in from the west, where the detours had thinned the traffic into a crawl, and their presence redirected the last clear lane into a line that would not move until someone gave it a reason. Homelander rose to meet the aircraft because it was something that acknowledged him, and acknowledgement had become scarce. The light in his eyes dimmed as he tracked the angle of approach, calculating how much force would be required to turn a federal suggestion into a personal one. I stayed near the curb because stepping into the line of vehicles would slow the paramedics who were now trying to carry their gear on foot. The grocery bag had begun to sweat where the fountain water had reached it, and that would matter later if the paper softened before I got home. Starlight moved along the edge of the new perimeter, her attention shifting from the sagging alley to the men stepping out of the unmarked transport. They weren't looking at Homelander first. They were looking at me, because the analysts upstairs had decided that the absence of reaction was the most unstable element in the frame. Ashley's voice came through an earpiece somewhere above us, authorizing a protocol designed for assets that refused direction rather than enemies who resisted it. The wording was careful enough to pass through legal before it reached the street, and blunt enough that no one mistook it for advice. The aircraft's hatch opened, and something was lowered that did not care about spectacle. It was meant to change conditions instead of winning, to turn a public test into a private environment where the lack of compliance could be studied without a camera deciding what it meant. Homelander dropped back to the plaza because the deployment was not his, and the distinction mattered. The landing finished the crack that had been creeping toward the adjacent apartments, and a stairwell window gave way with a sound that would carry into the floors above. I shifted 2 steps again to keep clear of the men moving past me with equipment that would close the intersection entirely. Avoiding him would have been simpler, but doing so would push me into the space they needed to establish their line. A train sweep ended at the new perimeter, where he stopped because the order had been to map, not to act. His eyes flicked from the descending payload to the blocked ambulance lane and back to the place where the beam had done nothing useful except remove another option. Starlight understood that whatever came down next would not be aimed at stopping him. The city had been moved out of the way, so something else could begin. The payload didn't hit the ground so much as arrive in pieces that assembled themselves around the problem the moment they cleared the hatch. 4 emitters took the corners of the intersection with a precision that suggested they had been designed for somewhere less crowded, and the moment they touched down, the men who had carried them stepped back as if proximity were no longer part of their job. Traffic that had been inching forward now stopped entirely, not because of an order, but because the air between the devices changed in a way that made movement feel like a mistake. The line of ambulances that had rerouted from 7th found a second dead end forming in front of them, and the drivers began to turn off their sirens one by one as the delay became permanent. Homelander hovered at the edge of the forming perimeter, watching something enter the situation that would not ask him for permission to do it. His attention shifted from me to the emitters and back again, because whatever this was, it had been authorized without his name attached. I remained where I was because stepping into the newly marked space would force the paramedics to divert again, and the detours had already stretched their routes beyond what the city could absorb. The grocery bag had softened at the bottom, which meant I would need to support it from underneath if the pavement became uneven. Starlight saw the perimeter close before anyone announced it. The air shimmered between the emitters in a way that bent the light from the street lamps, and the first civilian who tried to cross found themselves turned back by something that offered resistance without contact. Her hands went up again, not to intervene, but to guide people away from a boundary they couldn't see. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley's analysts watched the live feed shift from confrontation to environment. The goal was no longer to force a reaction, but to remove variables until the absence of one became measurable. The emitters synchronized with a low tone that settled into the street like a second atmosphere. Dust hung where it had been pushed by the downdraft, and the tape someone had tried to string earlier now lay flat against a boundary that did not move when the wind did. Homelander descended into the edge of it and found the air heavier than it should have been, as if the intersection had been asked to hold more than its share of attention. He struck once at the shimmer and watched it ripple without breaking, a response that did not offer him a line he could deliver later. I shifted the bag to keep the eggs from pressing against the softened paper and took a step to avoid a crack that had widened under the new vibration. Avoiding the perimeter would have meant stepping into the stalled line of vehicles, and that would slow the people who were now carrying stretchers by hand. A train stopped at the boundary because the order had been to observe how far it spread. His gaze tracked the way the shimmer closed the last gap between the fallen overhang and the bent signal, turning the intersection into a space that would not route anything through it again. Starlight realized then that this had never been about stopping him. The containment had been built for someone who wasn't fighting back. The boundary didn't announce itself with force so much as with certainty. Light bent along its surface in a way that made straight lines hesitate, and the dust that had been drifting since the last landing now hung in a shallow curve where the air had decided to be different. People who had been trying to cross the intersection stopped without understanding why, their attention pulled by the absence of motion in a space that should have been clearing by now. I adjusted my grip on the grocery bag because the bottom seam had begun to give, and letting it tear here would leave glass underfoot, where the paramedics were already struggling with the stretchers. The pavement inside the perimeter felt no different than before, which meant the effort to step out would be unnecessary unless someone needed the path. Homelander stepped in again because the shimmer had refused him earlier, and refusal, when it comes from a thing, can be answered. His strike landed where the light bent most sharply, and the ripple that followed moved outward without breaking, a response that turned the boundary into a surface he could not dominate with attention alone. Starlight watched the exchange and understood that the cameras would read it as a stalemate if nothing changed, which was exactly what Ashley's analysts needed to avoid. A stalemate implied parity, and parity would suggest that someone else could stand where I was standing and make the same absence into a tactic. Inside Vought Tower, the model updated to account for a new problem. If containment worked on me, it would work on anything that chose not to perform. The recommendation shifted from measurement to provocation, not to win, but to make the boundary mean something on film. The emitters answered with a tone that rose just enough to make the glass in the remaining storefronts tremble. A hairline spread across a display window, and turned into a clean break that spilled into the lane the ambulances had hoped to use if the alley cleared. I stepped half a pace to keep the bag from brushing the charred field, because replacing dinner would now mean waiting behind a perimeter that was not designed to open on schedule. Avoiding Homelander would still require more effort than staying, and staying kept the stretchers moving along the only path that remained. A train traced the outside of the boundary and reported that the delay had spread into 3 adjacent blocks where the detours met. The city was no longer bending around a fight. It was learning to root itself around a space that would not resolve. Homelander's eyes lit again, not at me but at the surface that had turned his last answer into a ripple. The beam held steady where the shimmer was brightest, and the light returned it without comment, folding the heat back into the air until the traffic sign behind him softened and slumped. Starlight realized then that dominance didn't require resistance if the environment could be made to carry it. The intersection had become a decision someone else had made, and every attempt to force a reaction only clarified who it had been built for. Somewhere above us, another authorization cleared a threshold that would not be undone by apology. The perimeter began to do what it had been designed to do the moment the authorization came through. The tone settled into a frequency that pushed movement toward the edges, and the last civilians who had tried to wait it out found themselves guided by an absence rather than an order. Emergency lights reflected off the shimmer in a way that made the boundary visible only when you stopped looking directly at it, which kept people from testing it twice. I shifted the bag again, because the softened paper would not hold if the ground dipped under another landing. The path the paramedics were using had narrowed to a strip between the fallen pole and the service truck that had arrived too late to be useful, and stepping into it now would force them to choose between slowing down or turning back. Homelander remained inside because the boundary had turned into an audience that would not applaud. Each time he struck it, the ripple carried outward and translated into something else giving way beyond the intersection. A window, a sign, the last intact hinge on the pharmacy's rear door, until the city began to answer for blows that never reached me. Starlight watched the evacuation line form along the west barricade and realized that resistance had stopped being a person. The company had turned it into an environment, and the environment did not need to win as long as it made the lack of compliance visible. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley's analysts flagged a secondary effect that none of them had modeled. The boundary was not just containing me, it was containing Homelander's attempts to define the encounter, folding each escalation back into infrastructure that could not consent to being part of it. The more he tried, the more the delay spread into blocks that had nothing to do with the plaza. A-Train reported that the detours had reached the hospital loop and that the next ambulance would arrive on foot unless someone cut a lane through the parked line that had formed when the signal fell. The recommendation that followed did not mention heroes at all. The emitters answered with a second adjustment that made the air inside feel heavier, not to me, but to the dust that now refused to settle. Light from the street lamps broke along the curve and returned in a way that turned straight edges into shallow arcs. I remained where I was because leaving would push the stretcher team into the glass field that had spread from the broken display. Avoiding him would still mean more effort than staying, and staying kept the only clear path predictable. Homelander's eyes dimmed as he recognized that the boundary was not reacting to him in a way he could escalate against. The cameras above had begun to frame the shimmer instead of his landing, and the story the city would tell tomorrow had shifted without asking him. Starlight understood then that whatever came next would not be about ending the encounter. It would be about making it irreversible. The third aircraft didn't slow as it approached, which meant the decision had already been made somewhere that wouldn't be present when the paperwork was signed. Its lights were off, and its path cut across the chopper's orbit without asking for space, and the payload it carried was too large to be mistaken for anything designed to reassure a crowd. Inside the perimeter, the tone shifted again, not louder but deeper, and the dust that had refused to settle now lifted in a slow ring that followed the emitter's corners. The change didn't make the pavement feel different underfoot, but it did make the glass at the edge of the intersection creep another inch into the lane the stretcher team had been using. I stepped around the new spread because letting it cut through the soles would mean tracking it home later. Avoiding the boundary would have required moving into the line of armored vehicles that had closed the west approach, and that would slow the paramedics who were already carrying more than they should. Homelander looked up because the arrival had not been his to manage. The hatch opened with a sound that didn't travel, and what descended did so with the kind of patience that suggested it had been built to outlast a headline. It was not aimed at him, although it would pass through his air to reach the space that had refused to answer. Starlight watched the shadow it cast and understood that Vought had crossed from mitigation into experiment. The cameras widened to keep both the boundary and the descending frame in view, because whatever happened next would need to be explained without admitting it had been intended. Ashley's analysts had modeled for resistance, for escalation, even for public panic. They had not modeled for indifference that forced their solution to include everyone else's route home, and the recommendation that cleared the last threshold did not include a line for reversal. The frame touched down inside the shimmer and unfolded into something that did not ask for permission to be part of the street. Its arms found the corners the emitters had already defined, and the tone beneath us settled into a frequency that made the traffic lights along the next block flicker out of sequence. I shifted the bag to keep the eggs from pressing against the seam as the pavement trembled under the new weight. Avoiding him would still take more effort than staying, and staying kept the stretcher team moving along the only path left between the fallen pole and the service truck. Homelander struck the new surface once and watched the ripple travel through the frame and into the pharmacy's rear wall, which answered by giving up the last of its support. The sag turned into a drop that sealed the alley completely and forced the next ambulance to stop 2 blocks out. A-Train reported that the hospital loop had begun to backflow into the detours, and the city's shape shifted another degree away from what it had been an hour ago. The battleground had become a system that would not return to normal when the perimeter lifted. Starlight realized then that this had never been about ending the test. It was about proving it could continue. The first ambulance that had been forced to stop outside the sealed alley turned its engine off, not because the situation had improved, but because idling would no longer get it closer to the doors it needed. The stretcher team inside the perimeter had reached the point where the glass field narrowed to a step, and each adjustment to the tone beneath us pushed another shard into their path. I shifted a half pace to keep the grocery bag from brushing the edge of the frame that had unfolded around the emitters. The seam would not hold if it caught on anything raised, and replacing dinner now would mean walking a route the detours had turned into a loop. Homelander hovered near the center because leaving would make the cameras choose between him and the machine that had been authorized without his name. His attention moved from the ripple his last strike had caused to the pharmacy's rear, where the drop had sealed the service entrance with a weight that would not be lifted tonight. Starlight understood the arithmetic before anyone said it out loud. The delay had reached the hospital loop, and the next patient would arrive on foot if they arrived at all. Resistance had been redefined as an environment, and the environment was now costing time no one could recover. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley's analysts flagged the first confirmed loss tied to rerouting rather than impact. It would not show up on the same report as the cracked plaza or the fallen signal, and that was the point. The system had been built to absorb blame in pieces too small to film. The frame inside the shimmer adjusted again, its arms settling into the corners the emitters had defined. The tone beneath us did not rise, but the street lamps along the next block dimmed in a way that made the boundary easier to see if you stopped looking for it. I remained where I was because stepping into the narrowed lane would force the stretcher team to turn back through the glass. Avoiding him would still require more effort than staying, and staying kept the only path predictable. Homelander's eyes lit once more, not at me, but at the surface that had turned his last answer into a delay someone else had paid for. The beam held and returned, folding the heat back into the air until the last intact hinge on the pharmacy's rear door softened and gave. A-Train reported that the backflow had reached the emergency entrance and that security was beginning to triage in the parking structure. The city's shape shifted again, this time in a way that would not correct when the perimeter opened. Starlight watched the stretcher team stop and understood that something had already been lost that would not be counted here. The test had moved beyond the intersection. The first block lost power without warning, which meant the grid had been asked to do something it had not been designed to refuse. Street lamps along the hospital loop went dark in a stagger that moved faster than the traffic that had been trying to reach it, and the parking structure security lights took a second longer before they followed. Inside the perimeter, the tone settled into a depth that made the air feel occupied, and the shimmer that had bent light now held it in place long enough for the boundary to become visible from 3 blocks out. The stretcher team that had been waiting at the glass field stopped because the path they had been using no longer connected to anything with electricity. I adjusted my grip on the grocery bag because the bottom seam had finally begun to separate, and letting it tear here would scatter what remained across a pavement that would not be cleaned tonight. Avoiding the frame would still require stepping into the stalled line of armored vehicles, and that would slow the last team trying to move someone through the parking ramp. Homelander looked up as the blackout spread because whatever had crossed the threshold was no longer his to define. The cameras above shifted to keep the darkening blocks in view, and the story that had begun as a confrontation now included every elevator that would not open. Starlight saw the hospital district dim and understood that the delay had become a loss that would not be reversed by lifting the boundary. The company had wanted a reaction, and in the absence of one, it had built a system that would produce consequences instead. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley's analysts watched the model fail in a way that could not be contained by wording. The recommendation that followed did not include mitigation. It included continuation, because stopping now would mean admitting the test had not been about safety. The frame inside the shimmer adjusted once more, its arms drawing a fraction closer to the corners the emitters had defined. The tone beneath us held steady, and the traffic signals along the next 3 blocks flickered out of sequence before they went dark entirely. I stayed where I was because leaving would push the last stretcher team into a stairwell that had already filled. Avoiding him would still take more effort than staying, and staying kept the only predictable path from collapsing into guesswork. A-Train reported that the emergency entrance had switched to manual intake, and that the loop was now a corridor for foot traffic alone. The city's shape shifted again, this time in a way that would outlast the night. Starlight realized then that the threshold had not been the boundary. It had been the grid. The power didn't come back when the tone finally stopped. The shimmer thinned and then vanished between the emitters, and the frame inside it folded in on itself with the kind of care that suggests someone expected to use it again. Street lamps along the hospital loop remained dark, and the parking structure continued to take patience by hand because the elevators would not answer a button that no longer had a circuit behind it. I shifted the grocery bag into the crook of my arm because the seam had given way completely, and the only thing holding it together now was the pressure of my grip. The glass field that had spread from the broken display remained where it was, catching the last of the emergency lights and turning the narrowed lane into something that would not be safe to cross even in daylight. Homelander landed in the center of the intersection as the last drone pulled back, and the silence that followed did not offer him a line to deliver later. The cameras that had once framed his hover now held on the dark blocks beyond, because the story had moved somewhere he could not reach with his eyes. Starlight stepped toward the sealed alley and stopped when she saw that the pharmacy's rear had settled into a new shape that would not lift with a jack or a promise. The ambulance that had been waiting outside remained there, its doors open to a path that no longer connected. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley's analysts began to sort the losses that would not share a column with cracked stone or fallen signs, delays that had become absences, reroutes that had become distances, a loop that had become a corridor for foot traffic alone. The test had produced what it needed, and the need had not included a reset. I stepped off the curb because the water from the split fountain had reached the place where I had been standing earlier, and staying would mean wet socks for the walk that would now take longer than planned. Avoiding him would still require effort that would push me into the path the paramedics were using, and there was no reason to make their route worse. A-Train reported that the hospital would remain on backup through the morning, and that the detours had been written into the city's traffic plan until further notice. The shape of the night had become the shape of the week. Homelander looked at the place where the boundary had been and found nothing that would answer him. The absence had remained an absence, and the city had paid the difference. Starlight understood that whatever had happened here would not end when the street cleared. The world would root itself around this intersection from now on. The test had never required a fight. It had required that one never begin.